those are the first things that I started to pick up on my drive from the airport to, the house. And I remember just feeling this sense of like, just my heart kind of sinking to say, wow, is this home? And things just got worse. Like, it was culture shock upon culture shock upon culture shock. Hello everyone, my name is Kudzie Mapiye and welcome. On this channel, I do videos about my life living here in Australia, and I also share different life lessons that I've learned along the way. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking about reverse culture shock. And this is something for all the people who are living overseas, away from their home country, or all those people who are planning to move overseas and are expecting to go back to their home country either to stay or to visit. This is something that you are probably going to experience. Now, I'm going to be sharing, as usual, about my own experience with this. And I just wanted to talk about what it looked like for me when I had to go back to Zimbabwe for the first time after living in Australia for 4 years. So I went back for the first time in Zimbabwe in 2012 after arriving in Australia in 2008. So I had spent a significant amount of time away from Zimbabwe. And I think my reverse culture shock was a bit more extreme than would usually happen for other people because it depends on a number of factors. Now, I'm just going to talk more about what reverse culture shock is before I get into what my experience was, what I learned, and what I would like to share with you guys just to be mindful of when you are also returning home or receiving people who have returned home from overseas. So reverse culture shock is pretty much the opposite of the culture shock that you experience when you go to a new country. So this is the feeling of like just experiencing the difference, experiencing the change in the way things are done, the things that you're used to and how they're done differently, how things look differently, what is considered acceptable or not acceptable in the country that you're coming from as opposed to the country that you're going to. So when I came to Australia, I definitely experienced culture shock. I have done a video previously about the experiences that I've had and my culture shock experiences in Australia, and you can scroll down my channel if you're interested to find out more about that. I do have a few videos on it, but I have experienced things like just culture shock in terms of like expectations, in terms of relationship dynamics, how they work in Australia versus in Zimbabwe, how things are done, like customer service. All those type of things are the things that I had a culture shock about when I came to Australia. Now, in 2012, I decided to visit home for the first time after, completing my degree, studying in Australia, and I had stayed for 4 years. And during those 4 years that I'd been in Australia, I had always missed home so much, and I would look forward to the day I would go back home. So I would always be like, I can't wait to go back home. I can't wait to go back home, because you have that feeling that home is where you fit in. Home is where things are, comfortable, you're used to it, you don't have to make much of an adjustment either, in terms of fitting in, just in terms of living. It's where you belong. And I had been wanting to go home for such a long time, and I finally got the opportunity to go back home, and I tell you what, it was not what I expected. Of course, initially there was that feeling of exhilaration, like, oh my goodness, I'm home, I can't believe it. Like, you just literally want to kiss the soil, you want to hug the trees. You just want to express your joy to be back on your home soil. So that was my initial reaction when I landed at the airport and I saw my family, after a while. I had seen them previously, but not in Zimbabwe. So by just seeing them after a long time, it was a really, really good experience. The culture shock for me started as we were driving home from the airport. And I started to notice that things don't look the way I thought they would look. There was a bit of a difference. And after having lived in Australia for 4 years, even just the air, like the way things looked, I remember the roads, it looked a bit dustier. It looked like, the grass on the sides of the roads was a bit overgrown. Like, those are the first things that I started to pick up on my drive from the airport to, the house. And I remember just feeling this sense of, like, just my heart kind of sinking to say, wow, is this home? Like, this is not what this is not what I was used to. And what actually happens with reverse culture shock is the things that you had gotten used to, because you have now gotten used to something else, they now seem unusual, even though when you were there, you didn't even notice it. Like in 2008, there was grass on the side of the road, and sometimes it was overgrown, but I didn't notice it because I was so used to it. And, it was just this feeling of, oh my goodness, this is so different. And a place where I thought I would just come and slot in, fit right in and just go with the flow, I was finding I was having to do a little bit of an adjustment, first with just what I was seeing, then like even listening to the radio. I remember on the way home, like, the radio was on in the car, and just the radio station, like it was so different. I was so used to like Australian radio, like B105, shout out. I was so used to Australian radio stations and how, like, and Australian humor and the way they do things, and listening to Zimbabwean radio stations was like, it was a great feeling, but it was different. It was like an adjustment. Like, it seemed like I was adjusting to every little thing, and it felt like I was nitpicking or like kind of like whinging about a few things. But that's what I thought then. But now that I know what was happening and I'm reflecting back, I understand that I was actually experiencing reverse culture shock. I was readjusting to the culture that I was used to, but it felt so different and so unusual. And it didn't even end there. I remember arriving at home, and I had grown up in this house. I had been in this house for many years. And I remember coming into the house and I'm like, the walls look so different. And one thing about Zimbabwe and Australia, Zimbabwean houses are made of bricks. Like on the inside, they're plastered with like concrete, and it's like a brick house. And in Queensland, in Brisbane, where I live, the houses are made of wood. So they have brick on the outside, but on the inside, they're actually like plastered with like wood. So the look actually looks different. If you look at a concrete wall and a wooden wall, they look very different. So I think it was my eyes adjusting to those differences. I started to see, oh my goodness, the walls look different. Oh my goodness, this place doesn't look the same as what I left it. But it was all this culture shock. And then came even like getting now used to having like live-in help, like having a maid in the house. That was a reverse culture shock moment for me. I remember like the maid bringing food to the table, and how in Zimbabwe people like have a bowl and a jug, and they wash their hands at the table. All those little things, I was so like fascinated by things that I have grown up with for years, for decades, but it just seemed so different because I had been away from it for so long. And I just remember feeling that sense of belonging wasn't as strong as I had wanted and I had hoped it was going to be when I returned back home. And things just got worse. Like, it was culture shock upon culture shock upon culture shock for like the whole period of time that I was there. And I remember like feeling, you almost feel like you're not yourself, because you're like, everyone is finding everything normal. Everyone's just getting along with life. Everyone's like, things are not unusual for anyone else except for me. So I did feel that sense of like separation, that sense of difference, that sense of not fully fitting into my own culture. And it was like, it wasn't very pleasant, and and people would notice a few things, or like, you know, because you start to verbalize some of these things, like, oh, like, or even having dinner at a certain time. In Australia, dinner is had like quite earlier in the night, and also in Zimbabwe, I mean, at my house, I know that dinner is had a bit later. So even things like that was like, why are we having dinner so late? Why is this? Oh, why does this look like that? Or why is this like that? You're commenting on the roads. You're commenting on every little thing. And I don't know how people in Zimbabwe take it when people come back from overseas. I think there is like a sense of annoyance, like, come on, like, you know, you're used to this. Stop acting like you don't know what's going on here. But reverse culture shock is a real thing. It is like, you know, it actually happens. And I'm sharing this video because I feel like these subtle differences that people notice, and things like reverse culture shock, can create a little bit of separation even in relationships, when people feel like, oh, now you think you're different from us, or now you think we're backward, you think you're so forward, or whatever. Now you think you're complaining about things you're used to, and it can start to create a little bit of separation, and, you know, maybe even friction if people start to get annoyed by your comments. But I just wanted to share this for the people who receive, like, you know, their relatives who have been living overseas, that reverse culture shock is a legitimate thing. These people are actually experiencing these things, and it's not that they're wanting to nitpick or, you know, whinge about things that are going on at home, but they're actually trying to adjust. And you will notice this more for people who spend several years away from home and then return after a couple of years, like I did after 4 years. I mean, that was a little bit too long. I think it's always good, if you can, to return home if you still want to maintain that connection, those relationships, and you want to lessen the degree of reverse culture shock. It's always good to go back as often as possible, because those differences don't become as extreme and your reactions are not as extreme, and you find that you come back home and you kind of like slot back in and you back in the rhythm of things, and vice versa. So, you know, it's always good to visit home if you can. I know that it's not always possible, like things are expensive, people have responsibilities overseas, so it's not like, you know, money is hard to come about and, you know, like that. But for those people who do have the resources, if you want to lessen that reverse culture shock, go back home as often as you can and maintain the relationships and maintain that sense of belonging. Because to be honest, I've been in Australia for 15 years and there is still a sense of I don't fully belong here. But to tell you what, like, the strangest thing is, over the 15 years I have felt more connected to Australia than I have to Zimbabwe, because I have lived in Australia like for longer, like, you know, for longer periods of time, like longer chunks of time, and it just becomes more normal. And I do always have a little bit of an adjustment and a little bit of like reverse culture shock whenever I do go back home. The last time I was back was 2019, and I remember, yeah, I did experience still a bit of like reverse culture shock, but because I had been back before, like 2 years before, 2017, it wasn't as bad as what I experienced for the first time in 2012. So yes, guys, reverse culture shock is real. It does happen, and your relatives are not trying to be bougie or trying to be, you know, like, oh, you know, this is so different, you guys are so different. It's actually a real thing. So please do have a bit of compassion. I know it can be annoying, and if you are going back home, do also, like, you know, understand that you are experiencing reverse culture shock, and it's not everything you need to verbalize, because people can take it the wrong way as well. You can, like, you know, just kind of take note of it and say, oh, this is what I'm experiencing, and, you know, kind of make sense of it that way. And this is all to maintain our relationships, guys, and to understand the things that go on for people who are living overseas, that, you know, it's not all roses. We do have those things that we do need to adjust to, and even though it seems like you know, these people feel like they don't belong here. It's not a good feeling to not feel like you belong in the country that you were born in the country that you feel you should have a sense of belonging. It is not a good feeling at all. But if we understand each other and if we understand reverse culture shock, I'm hoping we'll all be able to, you know, adjust a little bit better and maintain our relationships with our family and friends in the countries where we come from. So that's it from me, guys. I will see you in my next video. Bye.